Obesity makes over 200 diseases and complications more likely. I'm older now than my grandfather ever got to be. He died of a heart attack. My uncle died of a heart attack. My dad had really bad heart problems. What these drugs do is they inject you with an artificial copy of GLP-1. This artificial GLP-1 stays in your system for a whole week. The year I was born, 1979, 6% of people in Britain were obese. It's now 27%. Obesity has more than tripled. There's something about the food that we're eating that's undermining our ability to know when to stop. There are incredible benefits to these drugs. Sometimes we say stigma doesn't work when it comes to weight loss. Actually, the truth is even worse. Stigma makes people fatter. What the fuck? How did we get to the point where half the population want to drug themselves? For me, the most unpleasant kind of side effect was...
Why don't you just diet and exercise instead?
The truth is, we did not get fat because we had a failure of willpower. We got fat because the food industry hijacked our appetites and changed our bodies to make us crave food that undermines our ability to know when to stop. And I went to places where they didn't allow that to happen. Think about Japan. In the United States, 42.5% of people are obese. In Japan, it's 4%.
You talk about, the psychology behind why we overeat.
90% of women have a negative body image, which is kind of staggering. 90 are chronically dissatisfied with at least one part of their body.
Is there a way we can improve our body image? What is your conclusion on these drugs? Would you recommend them to someone you love? For the past year, Johann has been on a journey to discover the effects of the new weight loss drug that's taking the world by storm. You've probably heard about it. In his new book, Magic Pill, Johann is examining how these new drugs are transforming weight loss as we know it. He shares his own experience with Ozempic and talks about how we can heal society's dysfunctional relationship with food, weight, and our bodies. Before we begin, I'm proud to announce that today's episode is sponsored by Headway app. Do you struggle to find time for reading? Trust me, I get it. Most people do, and that's exactly where Headway comes in. Picture this. Thousands of non-fiction book insights delivered to you in concise 15-minute summaries that you can either read or listen to. I'm a big fan of Headway because I believe it's the perfect app for anyone with a busy schedule that still craves knowledge. And here's a bonus. Headway also offers summaries of the books of today's guest, Johann. So go ahead and download Headway. You will not regret it. Johann, I'm so excited to be having this conversation with you. Thank you so much for having me in your lovely home and taking the time.
Hooray! I'm so happy to be here. Thanks so much.
Incredible. My first question is, why did you write Magic Pill? Why did you write about weight loss and these new drugs?
It's because I wanted to understand these drugs, and there was a kind of deep reason, which is that the minute I heard about them, I felt so conflicted and divided about them. And I really wanted to explore the truth about them. So I remember so vividly the moment when I first learned about them. It was that moment, it was the winter of 2022. So remember when the world was just opening up again?
Yes.
And I got invited to a party that was thrown by an Oscar-winning actor. I'm not saying that just to name drop. There's a reason why this is relevant. And on the way to the party, I remember sitting there in the Uber and feeling really self-conscious because I gained loads of weight during lockdown. I was quite fat at the start and I gained a lot of weight during lockdown. But I suddenly thought, oh, this is going to be interesting because everyone gained weight during lockdown. It's going to be fascinating seeing these Hollywood stars like having pudged out a bit.
Yes.
So I arrived and I started walking around and it was the weirdest thing. It's not just that they hadn't gained weight. They were all gaunt. Right? They had visibly lost weight. They looked like their own Snapchat filters. They were like kind of sharper and clearer. And I was kind of thrown. And I bumped into a friend of mine on the edge of the dance floor. And I said to her, wow, it looks like everyone really did take up Pilates during lockdown. And she laughed. And I must have looked at her blankly. I didn't know why she was laughing. And she said, right, well, you know it's not Pilates, right? And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. And she pulled up on her phone an image of an Ozempic pen. And I learned in the next couple of days that there's this new class of weight loss drug that is having really remarkable effects. So people who take Ozempic, Wegovy, they're the same drug with different names, lose on average 15% of their body weight in a year. Oh, wow. For Mounjaro, which is the next generation of this class of drugs, people lose on average 21% of their body weight. And for the next ones that'll be out next year probably, people lose 24% of their body weight. And as soon as I learned this, I remember thinking just two things simultaneously. I remember thinking, okay, I can see there are obviously benefits here, right? Sadly, we know that obesity makes over 200 diseases and complications more likely. And that was very close to my heart because I'm older now than my grandfather ever got to be. He died of a heart attack. My uncle died of a heart attack. My dad had really bad heart problems. So I thought, wow, if there's something that really can reverse or massively reduce obesity, that's going to be good for people's health. But I also thought, I've seen this story before. Pretty much every 20 years, there's a new miracle weight loss drug that gets announced. Huge numbers of people start to take it, and then they discover it has some horrendous side effect. It gets pulled from the market, and it leaves a trail of really damaged people in its wake. And so I thought, can you really get all these benefits without a drawback? You know, is there such a thing as a free lunch, right? Or I guess a smaller free lunch in this case, right? I also thought about body positivity. We seem to be making progress on that. What will this mean for the growing acceptance we had of different body shapes? I worried about people with eating disorders. So for just so many things, I just thought, I don't know what to do with this. So I figured, right, okay, this is my job. I'm going to investigate this. So for a year, I took the drug and I went on this big journey all over the world, from Reykjavik to Minneapolis to Tokyo. I interviewed over 100 of the leading experts and other people affected by these drugs, the biggest critics, their biggest defenders. And I learned a huge amount about the drugs and how they work and what they're doing to us and what the risks are.
And how do they work? Can you walk me through like how Ozempic works?
So one of the really weird things is we don't totally know the answer to that question. We know it does work. It's quite disconcerting to go and interview the leading experts and ask them quite basic questions and then go, yeah, we don't really know, right? So there's a few things we do know. So if you ate something now, whatever it was, a meal, your gut, your pancreas would produce a hormone called GLP-1 quite quickly. And you'd get a flood of GLP-1 in your gut. And we know that GLP-1 is just part of your body's natural signals to go, Francesca, you've had enough, stop eating, right? But natural GLP-1 only lasts in your system for about 2 or 3 minutes. It's quite a short time, and then it's washed away. Now, usually that's enough, right? You get the signal, you stop eating, but a lot of people clearly it isn't. What these drugs do is they inject you with an artificial copy of GLP-1, but instead of being washed away in a few minutes, this artificial GLP-1 stays in your system for a whole week, right? Which has this effect on you it's kind of weird. I remember, I'll never forget, when I started taking it, 2 days later, I woke up, I was lying in my bed just over there, and I woke up and I was lying there, and I thought, oh, I feel something weird, what is it? And I was lying there, I couldn't locate what the feeling was. And it took me a couple of minutes to realise I'd woken up and I wasn't hungry. Every day before that, going back to when I was a kid, I used to wake up hungry. Often I would be woken up by being so hungry. And I got out of bed and I went to, there's a cafe just up the road from here. And I ordered the thing that I used to always order for breakfast, which is, it's kind of disgusting. It was a giant kind of bread roll with like lots of chicken and mayo in it. And Tatiana, the one who works there, brought it over to me and I had like 3 or 4 mouthfuls and I was full and I just didn't want to eat anymore. And when I left, she called after me. She was like, are you okay? Because it was so weird to her that I hadn't eaten the whole thing. And then for lunch that day, I went to this Turkish restaurant, again, just up the road. And again, I ordered the thing I would always order and I had 3 or 4 bites and I wasn't hungry. So it was very strange. So initially it was thought that these drugs work primarily on your gut, right? GLP-1 is obviously made in your gut. It's a gut hormone. So they thought, okay, it's a gut effect. It must be slowing down gastric emptying or something like that. And something is happening in your gut and that is well known. But increasingly scientists believe that the effect is not primarily in your gut, it's on your brain. So we know that you have GLP-1 receptors not just in your gut, but in your brain. And actually, we know that these drugs go all over your brain and seem to be changing not just your gut, but how your brain works, how you think and what you want, which seems to me a much more intimate, risky kind of transformation. Take a drug that's changing your brain, right? So it was fascinating to learn that. We don't really know what is happening in the brain, but we know it is having a big effect on the brain.
My question is, how did we get here? How did we get to this point where we're willing to inject ourselves with a drug to, stop eating?
Yeah, it seems completely crazy that we would reach a point, exactly as you put it, where, you know, so many of us would take a risky drug around which, 12 big risks that I write about in Magic Pill, to stop ourselves from doing something as natural as eating and feeding our bodies, right? What happened? And it was kind of shocking for me to learn about this, because the obesity epidemic has basically happened in my lifetime, right? The year I was born, 1979, 6% of people in Britain were obese. It's now 27%. Between the year I was born and the year I turned 21, obesity more than doubled in the US, and then severe obesity doubled again in the next 20 years, right? So this has just never happened before in the history of the human species. Across the whole world in my lifetime, obesity has more than tripled. So this is just staggering. No precedent for it in the 300,000 years that human beings have existed. And we know what's causing this. By far the biggest cause is where it happens everywhere where there's one big transformation. It's where people stop eating fresh food made out of whole foods that they prepare on the day, and where they move to eating processed and ultra-processed food, which is food that is assembled in factories, out of chemicals. The process isn't even called cooking. It's called manufacturing food, right? And that food, it turns out, affects us completely differently to the kind of food that your grandparents and my grandparents ate all their lives, right? And one of the people who most helped me to understand how it's affecting us differently and why it brought us to the point where 46% of Americans want to use these drugs is this fascinating experiment called Cheesecake Park. That's what I've nicknamed it, right? It's done by a professor called Paul Kenny, who's the head of neuroscience at Mount Sinai in New York. So Professor Kenny grew up in Ireland, in Dublin, and he moved to the US when I think he was in his 20s to do his PhD. And he quite quickly noticed, this was the 90s, Americans don't eat like Irish people, right? They would eat a lot more processed and junk food, and they ate a lot more fatty and sugary food. And like a lot of good immigrants, he quickly assimilated, and within a year he gained like 30 pounds.
Oh my God.
So he started to wonder if this food was like affecting his brain, changing his brain, making him want different food. So he designed an experiment to test this. He got a load of rats and he raised them in a cage, and they had nothing to eat for the first part of their life, but the kind of healthy whole foods that rats evolved to eat over thousands of years. They were in pellet form, but they were kind of healthy food. And they had loads of these pellets. But it turned out that when they had the kind of food they evolved to eat, they would eat when they were hungry and they would just stop. They never made themselves obese or overweight. There was something about this food that meant they had a kind of natural nutritional wisdom and they knew when to stop eating it. Then Professor Kenny tweaked the experiment. He introduced them to the American diet. He gave them a load of cheesecake, he fried up some bacon, he gave them Snickers bars, and they went crazy for this food. The rats would hurl themselves into the cheesecake and eat their way out of it and emerge like kind of slicked in cheesecake. He said he could never eat cheesecake again after seeing that.
I can imagine.
And what was fascinating was this natural nutritional wisdom that the rats had when they ate natural food disappeared, right? They just ate and ate and ate. And as the way Professor Kenny put it to me is within a couple of days they were different animals and they rapidly became obese, right? And they just couldn't stop eating. Then Professor Kenny tweaked the experiment again in a way that feels a bit cruel to me as a former junk food addict. He took away all this food and left them with nothing but the healthy food they'd grown up with. And he thought he knew what would happen. He was pretty sure. He thought, well, what will happen is now they're going to eat more of the healthy food than they used to in the past. And that'll mean that that'll prove that this junk food expands your diet, your desire for calories. That's not what happened. Something much weirder happened. When they had this American food taken away, they refused to eat anything at all. It was like they no longer recognized the healthy food as food. They would rather starve than go back to eating the healthy food. It was only when they were literally starving that the rats went back to eating the healthy food. Now, I think this fits with a much wider body of evidence about what's happened to us, right? As Professor Gerald Mand at Harvard put it to me, there's something about the food that we're eating that's undermining our ability to know when to stop, right? And actually there's scientific evidence for 7 reasons why that's happening to us that I write about in my book Magic Pill. But the key thing to understand is the way we eat, the way I've eaten since I was a kid, is undermining our satiety. Satiety is not a word we use that often, but, it's an important concept. Satiety is just the feeling of having had enough and not wanting any more, right? And this food undermines our sense of satiety. And what these drugs do is they give us back our sense of satiety in an artificial way, right? They give you back that sense of fullness. But you realise, if we'd never screwed up our food system in the first place, we wouldn't be in the position where we'd need these drugs, right?
So in your book, you also talk about your childhood and your relationship with your parents. How did that influence your relationship with food and, you as an adult now?
It's funny, my parents were both runaways. My dad was from this little village in the Swiss mountains, and he was raised in this pretty rough environment. You were, from the age of 5, he was having to work on the farm. And when he was in his early 20s, he was like, there has to be more to life than this. So he hitchhiked all his way across Europe to London. It was the 60s. So he'd heard there was some interesting thing happening in London, so he went. And my mother was a runaway. She grew up in this working class Scottish community, which was, very hard life for everyone, but particularly for women. And she ran away with her friend Mary. And my parents met in a nightclub near Carnaby Street when my dad didn't speak any English at all and my mother only spoke English.
In Soho, right?
Yeah, nearby. And they couldn't communicate, and they had what my mother called a series of one-night stands, which I've tried to explain is not a concept that makes sense. There's more than one of them. It's not a one-night stand. And she got pregnant, and they thought they had to get married. And really often she'll say, he seemed so nice when I couldn't understand what he was saying. And then he learned
good accent.
Well, not sure about that, but when he learned English, it all went wrong. And but they stayed together. And what was fascinating is they came from completely different food cultures, right? My dad, where he grew up in Switzerland, was basically the healthiest food culture in the whole world, right? You ate nothing but fresh, healthy food that you had grown or killed yourself. And my mum came from Scotland, which was even then ahead of the curve in having really unhealthy food, right? Yeah. This is the place that invented the deep-fried Mars bar, so gives you some sense of it. And one of the things that my parents argued about a lot was the way I ate. And one of the things that I found really interesting is basically the whole Western world in the last 40 years moved from eating like the way my dad grew up eating to eating pretty much the way my mother grew up eating. So from fresh, healthy food to processed junk food, right? But most places that happened slowly enough that you can notice it. Like if you look at a picture of a beach in Britain in like 1975, it looks really weird to us because everyone is what we would call skinny. And you're like, where's everyone else? And then you're like, oh no, that's just what people look like in 1975. But it happened, slowly enough that you can look at that and go, wow, that's a big difference. But it happened slowly enough that there wasn't that much friction. We basically blamed ourselves, right? We thought that we were weak. We didn't have enough willpower. And one place where that friction did happen, where it was brought to the surface, was in my own family, right? Because, I was raised by my grandmother. My mother was ill a lot when I was a kid, so I was raised by her mother, who was an amazing woman, for whom the happiest day of her life was the day we got a microwave, right? It's like, what, you don't have to cook anything again, right? It's amazing. So I would be raised with this, ultra processed food. And my dad, who was a cook, would come home and just be absolutely disgusted and enraged by this, right? He felt like he had been kind of catapulted out of a healthy food culture into this bizarre, sick culture. He would say, well, where do you think this food comes from, right? And unfortunately, my dad, Swiss child rearing when he was a boy was very hardcore, strict. There was no idea that you would try and persuade children of anything. You just sort of shouted at them, and if they didn't do what you said, you would just beat them. So unfortunately, he had no way of trying to persuade me of this, right? So he wasn't very effective, but he just kind of screamed at me about it and would try to force me to eat healthy food, which obviously did not create a very healthy relationship with food on my part. But it was so interesting that conflict played out in my own family, and I can really see how quick that transformation was. That the food that was just everywhere when I was a kid was food that my dad didn't even think of that as food, right? And he wasn't wrong. Humans transformed so quickly in what we consumed in a way that really undermined our ability to stop eating, made us obese, made us unwell, made us look different, walk differently, get different diseases. So that core insight wasn't wrong, although sadly he didn't communicate it in the best way.
Yeah. So, what are the side effects of Ozempic? You talk about, I think, 12 side effects in your book. Can you walk me through those, please?
Well, I would distinguish between two things. There's side effects and then there's risks, big risks, right? So Carel LaRue, who's one of the scientists who was involved in key stages of developing these drugs, said to me, there's two kinds of drugs. There's drugs that don't work and there's drugs that have side effects, right? So there's very common side effects related to these drugs, most of which I experience. So the most common is nausea. Almost everyone, when they start taking it, feels really quite nauseous. For the vast majority of people, that goes away. I've been taking it a year, I never get nauseous from it now. There's other well-known side effects. Actually, for me, the most unpleasant kind of side effect, as opposed to risk, was for a minority of people, it's not most people, but it's in the side effect list. It causes your heart to beat a bit faster. And for me, I experienced that as like anxiety. If your heart's racing, you're like, oh my God, I'm anxious. What's going on, right? Again, that has gone away now, but it took quite a long time for that one to go away. But for me, the subtitle of my book is The Extraordinary Benefits and Disturbing Risks of the New Weight Loss Drugs. And one of the reasons this is such a complex topic is because both of those sides are true. There are incredible benefits to these drugs that I'm sure we'll talk about. But there are some really big risks that I'm worried about. So I'll start with one. When we think about the safety of these drugs, a lot of the scientists who work on them make an important point. They say, look, actually, we know quite a lot about the medium to long-term effects of these drugs because diabetics have been taking these drugs now for 18 years, right? For people who don't know, in addition to having this effect on your appetite, the new weight loss drugs also stimulate the production of insulin, which is what diabetics need. So diabetics have been taking them for quite a long time. So the scientists say, if they had some catastrophic effect in the medium term, we would be seeing it in diabetics. We would know by now, right? And that's an important point, and there's a lot of justice in that point. But some other scientists said, okay, let's dig into the diabetics then. Let's look at this. So, for example, there's a professor called Jean-Luc Failly, who I interviewed, who's at the University Hospital in Montpellier. He was asked by the French Medicines Agency to do their investigation, the country's investigation, lead it, into the potential risks of these drugs. So he started looking at the risks in the animal studies when they give them to rats, and he noticed a very striking fact, which is that if you give these drugs to rats, they are much more likely to develop thyroid cancer. So he's like, okay, well, let's look at this with diabetics. So he looked at a group of diabetics who'd been taking these drugs between 2006 and 2016, I think it was, and he compared them to a group of diabetics who had not taken these drugs to see whether they had different outcomes. And what he calculated, him and his team, is that if you take these drugs, you are 50 to 75% more likely to develop thyroid cancer. Now, it's really important to understand what that doesn't mean. It doesn't mean if you take the drugs, the chances of you getting thyroid cancer are 50 to 75%. Okay. If that was the case, they'd pull the drugs from the market immediately. What it means is whatever your thyroid cancer risk was at the start, if he's right, and this is disputed, that risk will go up by between 50 to 75%. Now, a lot of the scientists involved say, well, that's a relatively low risk. About 1.2% of people get thyroid cancer in their lifetime. But it's a big increase in a small risk. Against that, and it gives you a sense of how whenever you're thinking about these drugs, you have to weigh the competing risks. So that's sounded to me really worrying, and it, I believe, is really worrying. You've got to weigh that against, okay, what's the cancer risk if you continue to be obese? And it turns out that is very significant as well. Cancer Research UK, the biggest cancer charity in Britain, explain, if you're carrying excess weight, that weight doesn't just sit there. It's not inert. It sends signals throughout your body. And one of the signals it sends is for cells to divide more rapidly, which can cause cancer, right? That's why your cancer risk really significantly goes up if you're obese. In fact, it's one of the biggest causes of cancer in Britain and in many parts of the world. So you really get a sense of, wow, when you're looking at the risks, you've got to be constantly weighing this complexity. Anyone who's talking about these drugs and is just going, rah, they're a miracle, they're going to save us all, I think we should be wary of them. But equally, people are going, oh, this is the devil's drug, it's evil. To me, the answer is much more interesting and much more complicated and layered, and we've really got to look at the 12 risks, the really big health benefits, and people have got to weigh that for themselves because different people have different risks. If you've got thyroid cancer in your family, for example, I don't think you should take the drugs. I would think that I would recommend against it, or that people should discuss it with their doctor. But equally, there are other risks like the heart disease in my family, which, makes me really want to take it, because we know that if you take these drugs, they reduce your risk, because they reduce obesity, they reduce your risk of a heart attack by 20%, pretty significant amount.
So you talked a bit about the risks and the benefits. Are there any other benefits for this drug?
So if we want to think about the benefits of these drugs, and they're really significant, I think the main one, the best way to understand it, is actually look at something a little bit different, which is bariatric surgery. So up to now, it's been extremely hard to lose a huge amount of weight and keep it off. It's not impossible, but it's been really hard without some kind of medical intervention. And the medical intervention we had up to now was bariatric surgery, things like stomach stapling. There's different forms of it. And it's a drastic operation. They only do it with really obese people. And it's a rough surgery. 1 in 1,000 people die in the surgery. It's no joke, right? But after the surgery...
My uncle did it as well.
Oh, really? How's he doing?
He's fine now. He lost a lot of weight, but then he gained it all back. So.
Oh, that's an interesting... let's talk about that. But that might relate to some of these drugs in an interesting way. But the reason why people go through this really grueling surgery is because the evidence shows the health benefits of reversing obesity and severe obesity are staggering. If you have bariatric surgery in the next 7 years, you are 56% less likely to have a heart attack. You are 60% less likely to die of cancer. You're 92% less likely to die of diabetes-related causes. In fact, it is so good for your health that you are 40% less likely to die of any cause at all, right?
Wow.
It massively improves your mobility. Most people, their back pain completely goes away, their sleep apnea. I mean, it has staggering benefits for health. So the early evidence from these drugs suggests they're having similar benefits, right? Like I just mentioned, if you take these drugs, you are 20% less likely to have a heart attack or stroke if you started with a BMI higher than 27. So we know, sadly, the science is really clear that obesity does seriously harm your health on average. Of course, there are exceptions, but on average harms your health. And by reversing obesity, you massively reduce these risks. There's a guy I interviewed called Jeff Parker, lovely guy. He's in San Francisco. He's a 66-year-old retired lighting engineer. And before I met him, he was severely overweight. He had gout, he had liver problems, kidney problems, heart problems, which is very common with obesity. And he was losing the ability to walk. It was painful to walk. And a friend of his went on one of these weight loss drugs, Mounjaro, and she had some left over, so she gave some to him. And he took it. He really rapidly lost a huge amount of weight. His health problems went into reverse. His doctor cut all this medication. Now he walks his dog over the Golden Gate Bridge every day, right? There's a lot of people like Jeff who are seeing their health profoundly transform as a result of these drugs. So when we think about the drawbacks and risks, and there are significant drawbacks and risks, we need to always bear in mind people like Jeff and those huge benefits as well.
I think a question that a lot of people have is, why don't you just diet and exercise instead?
I kept thinking this myself, right? I had friends who said this to me. I remember one night I was sitting having dinner with my friend Dave. He was eating a chicken schnitzel. I don't know why it stuck in my head. And he asked exactly that. It's like I was doing this agonizing calculation. How do we compare the risks of obesity versus the risks of the weight loss drugs? And he said, what are you talking about? There's a third option. I've seen you do it. Diet and exercise. Do that instead. There's no risk to that. And throughout my kind of adult life, I periodically done that, and I had indeed lost weight. And the evidence is really clear. If you burn more calories than you consume, you will lose weight. That's just the laws of physics, right? So I started to look at the science of dieting. And it's really interesting. So I interviewed an amazing woman in Minneapolis called Professor Tracy Mann, who's done some of the most important research on dieting in the world. And she started to research this in the year 2000. And at the time, it was thought that the science was just completely settled on this. Diets work. There were thousands of studies that looked at dieters and showed if you do that, cut back your calorie consumption, burn more calories, you'll lose weight. But Professor Mann noticed something. If you look at these studies, they're pretty much all 3-month-long studies. So you lose weight for 3 months, and then it just assumes you live happily ever after at that lower weight. But she was like, well, hang on a minute. I know lots of people who go on diets and then regain it. So she started to look for, are there any studies that look at people in the longer term. At that time, there were only 24 studies that looked at people, dieters, over 2 years, and there were a handful that looked at people over 5 years. And there, the results are completely different. Mm-hmm. Over 2 years, dieters lose, on average, 2 pounds, right? It's not nothing, but it ain't much, right? And she was really intrigued by this. Well, how can this be? Because we know this stuff about calories in, calories out. What's going on? So she spent a lot of time researching this, and there's a lot of scientists who I've interviewed have. And what we now know is the vast majority of people who go on a diet regain that weight quite quickly. And there's a big debate about why that is. But what we know is that as you gain weight, a series of biological changes happen in your brain that make it much harder to lose that weight. So let's say you gained 3 stone now, right? Your body would try to keep you at that higher 3 stone weight. So when you lost weight, when you tried to lose weight, when you went on a diet, it would slow down your metabolism, so you would burn calories much more slowly. It would make you crave more sugary, fatty foods. It would make you more lethargic, so you want to exercise less. It would make you pay attention more to fatty and sugary foods. So all these mechanisms combine to reduce your ability to keep your weight down, right? The way Dr. Giles Yeo, who's one of the leading experts on obesity at Cambridge University, put it to me, is your brain hates it when you lose weight, and it will fight to keep you at that higher weight. Doesn't mean it's impossible. We all know people who've done it, but it's really hard. And I remember thinking when I learned that, why would that be? That makes no sense. Why would evolution give us this thing that's bad for us, right? It seems so bizarre. And a lot of the scientists involved kept explaining to me, well, you need to think about the circumstances where we evolved. In the circumstances where humans evolved, the situation we now live in, where we're surrounded by an abundance of calories the whole time, that basically never happened. It was extremely rare. And if it did happen, it wouldn't last for long, right? The thing that evolution prepared us for was a completely different risk, which happened really often, which was famine, right? So it's quite often we would be facing a famine. So in those circumstances, it would make total sense. When there's food there, stuff your face and store it as much as possible, because when the famine comes, the fattest man at the start is going to be the last man standing. Like Timothée Chalamet is going to die in week 1 of the famine, and me at my fattest is going to be, standing there over Timothée Chalamet's corpse, alive and well, right? So you can see in that situation, evolution evolved us. If you can gain weight, keep that excess weight. But now evolution, our instincts are preparing us for a famine that is never going to come, right? So that's why we're in this sort of weird trap where, surrounded by ultra-processed and processed foods, which undermine our ability to feel full, lead us to gain weight, we then gain loads of weight, and it's very hard to go back the other way. It's not impossible without these things, but it's really hard, and it fails for most people.
That's so interesting and so true. While you were talking, it made me think about my own family, who grew up in Moldova. I was born in Romania, but, my parents, my grandparents, actually my great-grandfather, he died of hunger. So, maybe in the Western world it's not as recent, but for someone who grew up in Moldova or Romania, that's like actually really recent, a few generations away. And, both of my grandmothers are fat, and I see it is because they experienced hunger when they were young. So, what you're talking about makes so much sense.
And it's
so recent.
It's so recent. I think about my own grandmother, my Scottish grandmother, who I really loved. I've got a photo over there that, she grew up, it wouldn't have been as extreme as growing up in Moldova, but she grew up hungry, right? You were a working class girl in Scotland. So when my dad would say, why are you feeding this kid all this shit? My Scottish grandma would be like, why wouldn't you feed someone when there's food? My God, there's food. Eat, right? Yes. This is not like some distant, long ago thing. This is a few generations back, right? Yeah. That the risk of hunger was very real. Yeah.
And, since I was a baby, my family has been dieting. Like, my dad, my auntie, someone in my family was on a diet. And sometimes they would try these weird diets. I remember you talk about the tea diet as well.
Oh my God.
It was so funny. And they would just put all the weight back after a month.
And it can be even worse than that. So this is another big issue with dieting. When you cut back, your body slows down your metabolism to try to hold the fat you've got. So actually you cut back, which is why often, and it's happened to me many times, you go on a diet, you lose weight, but then in the aftermath, you actually end up fatter than you were at the start, right? And there's a big debate about, we were talking before about how these new weight loss drugs work. And the truth is, we don't know how they work in the brain. We know they're having a profound effect on the brain. They go everywhere in the brain. But one theory, which is contested and quite speculative, is that it interrupts that mechanism that says, hold the excess weight, right? Mm-hmm. It's almost like, if you imagine, so when you gain weight, your brain tries to keep you at that higher weight. The way one scientist put it to me is, it's almost like, I'm paraphrasing him, but it's almost like when you take your iPhone back to the factory settings, right? It lowers that mechanism. It certainly feels like that when you take the drug, right? It's this really strange thing where you, having spent so much time craving so much more food, that feeling literally just goes away. It is weird. And I remember, the book is called Magic Pill because there's sort of three ways in which these drugs could be magic, right? Mm-hmm. One is they could just solve the problem in a way that's so rapid and so impressive that you're like, whoa. And there are days when it feels like that. It's like, my whole life I've been inhaling KFC, and now once a week I do a little jab into my leg and I don't want it anymore. It feels like magic. Mm-hmm. The second way in which it could be magic is a more disturbing one. It could be magic in the sense of a magic trick, right? Mm-hmm. The conjurer who shows you a card trick but picks your pocket, right? It could be that it is giving me that benefit, but with a huge long-term cost. Mm-hmm. And we can talk more about the costs. The third way in which it could be magic, which is the one I actually suspect is most true, is it could be, if you think about all the classic stories about magic, like Aladdin, you get your wish, the magic takes place, but your wish unfolds in a way you never imagined at the start. Mm-hmm. And the magic kind of runs away from you. Or think about Fantasia, the magic kind of runs away from you in ways you couldn't have anticipated. So I think there are going to be all sorts of really unpredictable effects of these drugs. We're already seeing them unfold in ways that will be more disturbing and disconcerting.
So what's the other alternative then? If dieting doesn't work, what about maybe, is it a case of changing our lifestyle? I know you took a trip to Japan.
Yeah, so there's, one of the things that was depressing reading the book actually is the evidence about how little exercise works in producing weight loss. Exercise is really good for you, even though it doesn't produce weight loss. It boosts your health in all sorts of ways, reduces your dementia risk, heart disease risk. People should exercise. I'm strongly in favour of it. But it was pretty sobering, actually. I went to Iceland, where they introduced the biggest exercise program for young people in the whole world. All young people. They'd had a big problem with kids drinking alcohol and using drugs. So they introduced this amazing program where all young people take part in group exercise. And it's brilliant. And it's been incredibly effective in reducing drug use and alcohol use. And incredibly, didn't work at all on obesity. They're in fact fatter now than they were at the start. Wow. Exercise is not a very effective tool for reducing weight, unfortunately. It seems to be partly because we hugely overestimate how many calories we burn when we exercise. So we eat more to compensate. So, if you eat a large Big Mac meal, you'd have to run for 2 hours non-stop fast to burn off those calories. If you eat a Snickers bar, one of those tiny little Snickers bars, not the fun size ones, but the little ones, you have to run non-stop high speed for 20 minutes to burn off just a Snickers bar, right? So if you go to the gym and then you go and have a Snickers bar, you've more than cancelled out. And I definitely was guilty of that many times in my life, right? So in terms of the alternatives, so a lot of people are talking about these drugs as if basically we have two choices. Either we're going to be fat forever or you're going to have to take these risky weight loss drugs. And in the medium term, that is the choice many of us face. It's the choice I faced, right? You're in a trap and this is the trap door that's available to you. But in the longer term, that is not the choice we face, right? Because the truth is we did not get fat because we had a failure of willpower. We got fat because the food industry hijacked our appetites and changed our bodies to make us crave food that undermines our ability to know when to stop. And I went to places where they didn't allow that to happen. Think about Japan. In the United States, 42.5% of people are obese. In Japan, it's 4%, right? It's kind of weird that our mental picture of Japan is a sumo wrestler because, actually, it'd be like expecting an American to look like a bald eagle, right? There are almost no obese people in Japan. There's almost no market for these weight loss drugs in Japan because there's no one to take them, right? And I wanted to figure out, well, how did Japan do that? Japan is the third richest country in the world. How did they get rich without getting fat? And it happened by conscious design. 100 years ago, Japanese people did not eat what we think of as the Japanese diet. Their diet was terrible. They only ate protein once a week. And the Japanese government deliberately changed how people ate to make them healthier. It wasn't for a good reason. They wanted to have an army to invade the rest of Asia, but we've all got our bad intentions, right? And set that aside. And it led to this profound transformation of Japan where they became incredibly healthy. So I went to Japan to see how they do it and to eat like they eat. And their food is delicious. They're not denying themselves anything. It's just they eat food that makes you feel full, right? But also, it was unbelievably moving going to Japanese schools. I went to one called Koenji School, which is in centre of Tokyo. It takes kids from 6 to 18. And it was the weirdest thing, walking around a school where there's 1,000 children and there were no overweight kids.
Wow.
None. And I spoke to this amazing woman, Harumi Tatibe, who's the nutritionist who works at the school. So every school in Japan, by law, has to have a nutritionist. It's their job to design the school meals. The school meals have to all be made fresh that day. All processed food is banned. Kids are not allowed to bring in packed lunches. They've got to eat the fresh food that's used there. The food is prepared and they use this healthy food to educate the children about what they need, what they want. The food has all the different food groups in it. They educate them about that. They teach the kids to love this healthy food. And it was really weird for me because I'm going around interviewing these kids with my translator, Chie, and watching them eat this delicious, healthy school food. And I would say to them, like, this class I'm thinking of, they were like 9 and 10. I said, what's your favourite food? And one kid would go, white fish. And another kid would go, broccoli. And another kid would go... And I said to Chie, are these kids trolling me, right? Like, what their favourite food is, white fish and broccoli. And Chie just looked at me, my translator was like, well, yeah, we raise our kids to like healthy food. Like, she just couldn't understand. All the Japanese people I spoke to couldn't understand why I was puzzled by this. And I pulled up on my phone pictures of British school meals, the kind of things I grew up eating. And I didn't choose the worst pictures, just like a normal... And I showed it to the kids and they reacted like I had shown them an ISIS beheading video. They were like, what? They just could not understand it. They were like, what is this? And they said, did you eat this every day? I was like, yeah. And they're like, where's the vegetables? I was like, there are no vegetables, right? Gosh. They were like, where's the salad? I never ate any salad at school, right? They were just completely baffled. So Japan has taken all sorts of steps to stop kids being hijacked in the way that we are from the moment we're born to crave shitty, unhealthy food that makes us ill, right? And as a result, they have a healthy population. They have the longest life expectancy in the whole world. And I think one of the most moving experiences I had for the book was I went to a village called Ogimi, which is in Okinawa, the archipelago of islands in the south of Japan. It's the oldest village in the world. They've got 215 homes and 190 have someone over the age of 90 living in them.
Wow.
So there's nowhere in the world that has an older population. And I went there to speak to the people there, and I went to their little community centre. And one of the first people I met was a 102-year-old woman called Matsu Fukuchi. She walked to this community centre on her own. She had a cane, but, other than that. Wow. And she told me I can't stay long because I'm looking after my son who fell off the roof fixing it the other day. I was like, how old is your son? But anyway, so we chatted. She was such a happy person. She was talking about how it was volleyball season and she loved watching volleyball with her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren. She talked about how much she loved life. And then they put on some music and she put on a kimono and started dancing. And I danced with this 102-year-old woman. And I thought, this is wild. This woman was born before they started doing radio broadcasts in Japan. And I recorded our conversation on an iPhone and I danced with her. And I thought, this is the prize. This is what you get. If you sort out the obesity crisis, you get to have a long life, but more importantly, you get to have a healthy long life. Her knees aren't ruined. She's not demented, right? Obviously, not everyone gets to be 102, but they get to live longer than everyone else and they're healthy longer than everyone else. And I thought, this is what you get. You get more life, you get more joy, you get more dancing, right? That's why we have to really understand the obesity crisis. And that's why we have to figure out if this tool of the new weight loss drugs will help us or harm us. But that's most importantly why we need to deal with the underlying drivers of the obesity crisis and not just tolerate this being done to us and our children. Okay, I've got the shitty choice of these drugs versus continuing to be obese. But we don't need to tolerate that being the choice for our children, our grandchildren, and everyone who comes after us. We can fix this problem. Japan has done that. They're not a science fiction country. They can feel like it at times, but they're not. It's a real place. If Japan can do it, we can do it. And I know that can sound a bit pie in the sky, like, oh yeah, good luck with that. But, think about smoking, right? My mother smokes 70 cigarettes a day. There's a photograph of me and her where she's smoking, breastfeeding me, and resting the ashtray on my stomach. When I discovered this photo a few years ago, I showed it to her. I thought she'd feel guilty. She said, "You were a difficult baby. I needed that cigarette," right? She's completely unrepentant. But that was normal when I was a baby, right? In Scotland, you would smoke while you were breastfeeding a baby. When I was like a kid, people smoked everywhere in Britain. People smoked in the pub. People smoked on the train. The doctor used to smoke while he was examining you. It's not a joke. I remember it happening. Now, more than 50% of British people smoked when I was 8 years old. Now it's 12%. It's very unusual that you see a young person smoking cigarettes, right? There's an issue with vaping, which is real, but smoking cigarettes is almost gone among young people. That's a huge transfer. I would not have believed me when I was 8 years old if you told me we would almost get rid of smoking in Britain among young people. That would have seemed very unrealistic. We did it, right?
Yeah.
We can deal with these public health crises, but they don't change on their own. You've got to have a determination to deal with them.
And what can we do as individuals? What can parents do for their children to deal with this?
A lot of it has to be, firstly, we need to fight to stop your kids being fucked over, right? So more 3-year-old children know what the McDonald's M means than know their own last name, right? So from the moment we're born, we are bombarded with these images that are... Ronald McDonald is the second most recognised person in the whole world after Santa Claus.
Oh my God.
I know. More people in the world recognise the McDonald's M than recognise the Christian cross as a symbol of Christianity. So you think about how much this has taken over our minds and our cultures. So there's all sorts of things we can do. I think we should ban all junk food advertising. We should certainly ban it towards children. The other day I was watching with one of my godsons on YouTube some videos, and every ad is for junk food, right? So he's sitting there watching, Peppa Pig and just being absolutely bombarded with have a KFC, have a Pizza Hut. And now it's even easier. You just push a button. I can't imagine how fat I would have been as a kid if you'd been able to get that stuff. Just you push a button and someone brings it to your door, right? So there's all sorts of measures we've got to take to protect our kids. But the really important thing to understand is if you're obese, if your kid is obese, it's not that you failed. Right? This explosion in obesity did not happen because we lack willpower, because there's something wrong with us, because we're greedy. It happened because of these big social forces that have screwed us all over. And we've got to deal with those forces, and we can deal with them.
There's a lot of stigma against obese people. And I remember the number of times that I've talked to someone and they said, yes, I'm shaming them, but by doing that, I'm helping them. I'm motivating them to make a change. What do you think about that?
So, 45% of women who've got a BMI higher than 35 get insulted every single day, right? So they're just soaking up constant abuse. It's not like we haven't tried that way. Right? It's not like there are any fat people who didn't get the message. Oh, people don't like it when I'm fat, right? Believe me, they get that message, right? When I was fat, I got that message a lot. It's much worse for women than men, but believe me, fat men get it too, right? Actually, there's been a lot of scientific research into this. And sometimes we say stigma doesn't work when it comes to weight loss. Actually, the truth is even worse. Stigma makes people fatter. And there's lots of studies of this. And there's a whole range of reasons why. So one is stigma makes people comfort eat more, right? If I make you feel like shit, you're more likely to then go and, have a pizza or a KFC. It would have been a KFC in my case. That's very, you're triggering comfort eating in people. Secondly, there's a brilliant writer, Lindy West, who puts it really well. She said, why do we think making people hate their bodies will make them take better care of them? You don't take good care of a thing you hate, right? If we make people hate and despise their bodies, that doesn't lead to better self-care, right? Also, it leads people to put off medical care. I think something like 50% of overweight women in the US have put off going to the doctor because they're afraid of being shamed for their weight.
Oh.
Also, because all this shaming and stigma, it can mean that people actually hear well-intentioned medical advice, which they need to hear, as more shaming. It can actually make it harder for them to hear the important, genuine scientific evidence about obesity and what we can do about it. So, yeah, stigma doesn't work and makes the problem worse, and we should oppose it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You talked about comfort eating, and in your book, you talk about, the psychology behind why we overeat. And you ask a really interesting question. What job is overeating or being overweight doing for you? Why do you ask that question?
When I was taking Ozempic, this was something that came up that I really did not expect. So a friend of mine, Danielle, was pregnant the whole time I was first 6 months I was taking the drugs. And whenever we bumped into each other, it was like we were going in opposite directions. She was getting bigger and I was shrinking. And I remember one day saying to her, this is really weird. I'm getting what I want. I'm losing weight. But I don't feel better. If anything, I felt slightly worse. I don't want to overstate it, but I felt quite muted in my emotions. And there seemed to be a significant minority of people taking these drugs who are experiencing something similar. And I think for me, it really became clear to me one day why. So I was in Las Vegas and I'd had a day where I was investigating the murder of someone that I knew and loved. It was very difficult for a future book that I'm writing. So it was a rough day, and I went really on autopilot. I went to this KFC that I've been to a million times. And I went in and I ordered the thing I would have ordered like a year ago when I wasn't taking Ozempic. I ordered the big bucket of fried chicken. And I sat there and I ate a chicken drumstick and I looked at the rest of the chicken and I thought, oh, I can't eat this, right? Like you just can't eat very much when you're on these drugs. You would throw up if you tried to eat that much. And I remember it really vividly. Colonel Sanders was looking down at me from the wall like he was going, hey, what happened to my best customer? And I remember thinking, oh, I'm just going to have to feel my feelings. And one of the things that happens when you take these drugs, they profoundly disrupt your eating patterns. And what that means is the underlying psychological drivers behind your eating will come to the surface. So a lot of people, about 31% of women, 19% of men, comfort eat to manage their emotions, right? You feel bad, it calms you down, it soothes you. I was definitely in that category, much more than I realised when I started taking the drugs. And these drugs take away comfort eating from you. I couldn't do it. And that's painful. And I remember going to one of my best friends and saying, after I came back from Vegas, and saying, I'm going to have to stop taking these drugs. This is too much for me. And she said to me, look, stop if you want, but you need to know these drugs are not causing this emotional problem. That emotional problem was there all along. What they're doing is they're bringing it to the surface and giving you a chance to deal with it in a better way, right? That if you can learn to eat to feed your body and learn to manage your emotions in some other way, that's going to set you up for the rest of your life. That's what I've been trying to do. It's not easy, but that's what I've been trying to do.
You also address body image in your book and how most people have a really negative image of their own bodies. You give some crazy statistics. Is there a way we can improve our body image?
Yeah, I found this fascinating because this is, again, a relatively recent thing, right? If you look at studies from the 1950s, most people were happy with their bodies. If you look at studies now, most people, particularly most women, have quite a negative view of their own bodies. 90% of women have a negative body image, which is kind of staggering. 90 that are
Wow.
chronically dissatisfied with at least one part of their body. And I interviewed a really fascinating guy called Viren Swamy, who's a professor at East Anglia University. By the way, you should definitely interview him. Remind me, I'll give you an intro. He's a really interesting guy. He's done really cutting edge research on how you can improve your body image, how you can feel better about your body. And when I was taking Ozempic, I really began to think about this and look at his research. So he found that one of the key shifts you can make that will make you feel better about your body and get you out of this trap of being angry with or hating your body is something that the fancy term for it is functionality appreciation, but it's actually pretty straightforward. Instead of thinking about your body by like, how do other people judge my body? How many likes does it get on Instagram? That kind of thing. What you do is you think, ask yourself a key question. What can my body do that I'm grateful for, right? What can my body do that I'm glad about, right? So it might be, going for a run. It might be being able to bear a child. It might be being able to dance. So appreciating your body for what it can do rather than for how other people see it is a key shift. And then the next stage of that is what's called embodying activities, which again sounds fancy, but it's very straightforward. It's then taking part in activities with your body that give you joy. So I'm the worst dancer in the whole world, but I started dancing, right? I was trying to persuade people, will you dance with me, right? And having learned this, it really helped me to feel better about my own body and feel more rooted in my own body, and to sort of think, okay, so I'm going to think about my body, what it can do that I'm happy with, and what joyful activities I can do with it, rather than being in this comparison and contrast trap that we're all in, and which social media is literally designed to get us to do all the time, where you're like, I open Instagram and I see Daniel Craig and I don't look like Daniel Craig, and you're like, this is terrible. That's the path out of this trap.
I think a lot of young women and men, but like I remember in school, most of the girls in my class were so embarrassed about the way they look. They hated it. One of my really close friends, I found this out recently, she can't even look at herself in the mirror. Like she doesn't have any mirrors in the house, and she's not even overweight. She's like a healthy, weight, but she doesn't look like Kate Moss, or, she's not super skinny. And she only looks in these like really small mirrors. And I think that's absolutely crazy.
It's interesting you say that, because I was talking to one of my friends the other day, and I said it's slightly weird for me doing these interviews, because for the first time, because I'm taking these weight loss drugs, I'm aware people will be like looking at me and go like, oh, is he fat, right? And I said, it's really strange to be in a situation where I feel I'm being assessed for my looks, which is not how I've thought of myself before. And she said, welcome to the experience of every woman in the whole world every single day. And I was like, yeah, good point. But I think you're totally right. And one of the things I'm really worried about with these drugs, I think one of my three biggest concerns about the harms related to these drugs is in relation to eating disorders and how it can affect women's bodies. The moment that was absolute worst for me in the whole research for the book was, it must have been 4 or 5 months into working on it. I FaceTimed with my niece, Erin. So she's now 19, but she's the youngest in my family. And in my head, she's stuck as like a 6-year-old, right? So no one makes me more protective.
Still a baby.
Yeah, she's the only girl and she's the youngest, right? Whenever she has a boyfriend, I always want to go, get away from her, you paedophile. And then I'm like, oh no, wait, she's like an adult woman. You're not a paedophile, it's right. But her boyfriend's always very nice, but it's like, get away from her. But we were FaceTiming. She was in a pub in Liverpool, and she was saying, oh my God, like you've got a jawline. I never knew you had a jaw. And we were like laughing, saying, oh, you look really good. And I was sort of preening. And then she looked down and she said, will you buy me some Ozempic? I need some. And she's like a perfectly healthy weight. She always has been. And I thought, shit. Am I undermining every message I've been trying to give her since she was like a little girl? To not be judged about how you look, to be happy with your body. And I thought about, the gap even between my childhood and her childhood. In her childhood, she saw a much broader range of body shapes in famous women, right? And now, all those women who were broader body shape, pretty much, have dramatically shrunk, right? You think about, I don't want to name the women involved, but we can all picture celebrities who've suddenly dramatically shrunk. And I understand why they're not talking about the fact they're on Ozempic, because they would get loads of shit online. But unless there's been a massive outbreak of dysentery in Malibu, they're on these drugs. And we know that when you change the kind of venerated vision of what a woman's body should look like, that leads to more women hating their bodies and more women having eating disorders. And some men, but it's mostly women. So between 1966 and 1968, there was a massive increase in women being unhappy with their body shape. You think that's really weird, that's really quick, why would that happen? And it was because Twiggy, this very famous model at the time, who was super, super skinny, was sort of, and she was just naturally like that, but she was sort of presented as the face of female beauty. And, you know, a lot of women were like, oh, well, I'm not that. And so I'm particularly worried. We know, so even in the run up to the pandemic, eating disorders were at an unprecedented level. And then in lockdown, they went through the roof. So I'm very worried, given what we know, and more importantly, loads of eating disorders experts that I interviewed are worried, given what we know, that there are significant numbers of young girls and some young boys who want to starve themselves. And given that these drugs are an unprecedented tool for starving yourself, if you wanted to use them that way, I'm extremely worried that we will have a legacy of lots of young women starving themselves. Now, there is something we can do that would make that much less likely, and I really urgently think we need to do. And people like Dr. Kimberly Dennis, who's one of the leading eating disorders experts in the US, is arguing for this. And that's, at the moment, if anyone watching, if you want to get these drugs, you can go online. I mean, you can buy them illegally, but if you want to buy them legally, you can go online, you can see a doctor on Zoom. The doctor is meant to check your BMI, but how are they doing that on Zoom, right? And you'll get them. So you could be underweight, and in practice, you could get the drug for a prescription. Really That's really bad. So what Dr. Dennis argues is we should change it. You should only be able to get these drugs through an in-person consultation. The doctor should have to check your BMI and make sure you're not already, that you are in fact overweight or obese. Otherwise, you shouldn't be taking the drug. And the doctor should be trained in detecting eating disorders and should be able to talk to you about any past you might have with eating disorders. Now, that's not perfect in terms of solving the problem, but I think that would forestall some of the really problematic situation that we're about to face, I think, and we are facing with eating disorders. And we know this. In the 90s, there was an amphetamine-based diet drug that was quite popular in the US. And we know that huge numbers of women who were anorexic took them. There were these really heartbreaking, there was a congressional inquiry at the time, and going back and reading the testimony, it's heartbreaking. There was this incredibly articulate young woman called Jessica McDonald, who was a ballet dancer. We know about the horrendous pressures there. And she was taking so many of these amphetamines that she was just passing out, collapsing to starve herself. There was an incredibly moving testimony from a guy called Tony Smith, who was from State Center in Iowa. So his daughter Noelle, from when she was a little girl, had been obsessed with the belief that she was fat. She would constantly ask her parents, do you think I'm fat? Do you think I'm fat? Constantly looking at fashion magazines. And she started taking these amphetamine-based diet drugs, starved herself, and when she was 21, died of a heart attack induced by her anorexia. And he read out this poem by her that was really heartrending, that just says, you know, I want to eat, but I look at it, I say, not yet, not now, not yet.
Oh, that's
so so we know that obviously people with eating disorders will try to get these drugs. So we've got to be putting in place emergency measures to prevent that happening.
Absolutely. Who do you think should be taking these drugs? Like, what BMI do you need to have, for instance, to be able to get access to them?
So it's really weird for me, having researched this so much and spoken to the leading experts in the world, to still be quite uncertain in the advice that I would give people. I would say people should go very carefully through the risks and benefits that I lay out in Magic Pill and that they can read about in other places, and really carefully assess for themselves. And different people have different appetite for risk. But if you were like a person I loved who came to me and said, okay, I get all those caveats, but what should I do? This is what I would say. I would say if your BMI is lower than 27, do not take these drugs. You're taking all the risks for none of the benefits because you're not overweight or obese. If your BMI is higher than 35 and you don't have thyroid cancer in your family and you're not trying to get pregnant and you don't have a history of eating disorders, I would say, on balance, my personal advice would be that you probably should take these drugs because the risks of continuing to be obese at that level outweigh the potential risks of these drugs. If your BMI is between 27 and 35, it's much harder to judge. And I would say, you know, really go through the list, carefully think about it, and just weigh the risks for yourself. But it's hard. It's hard to even talk about this without using words like weigh, which I know are really annoying. But like it's difficult, and I don't have a simple answer for that. And I don't have a great deal of confidence in what I've just said. It's perfectly possible that some of these red lights that are flashing about these drugs, it's possible. I don't think it's the most likely scenario, but it's possible they'll turn out to be, really bad. And that, 20 years from now, someone will find my book in a secondhand bookshop and go, what a crazy fool he was to take these drugs. So there is risk at every turn here, but there's also risk we're carrying on as we were, right? Which was really harming our health and causing, and I think of all the things I learned from my book Magic Pill, I actually think, embarrassingly, the thing that most surprised me was the thing that I should have known all along, which was just how bad for you obesity is on average. So I'll give you an example. I think I've known since I was 10 years old that obesity makes it much more likely you'll get diabetes, right? Yeah. If you're obese at the age of 18, there's a 70% chance you'll become diabetic in your life. But I thought, okay, that's not good, but if you're diabetic, provided you live in a country like Britain where you get, insulin, you're basically like everyone else. Interviewing doctors, that is not the case. Diabetes knocks 15 years off your life on average. It is the biggest preventable cause of blindness in our societies. More people in the US have to have a limb or extremity amputated because of diabetes than because they got shot. Wow. It's really bad for you. It massively increases the chances not just that you'll die young, but that you'll have a terrible few years leading up to your death. And that's just one of the many causes associated. In fact, my friend Dr. Max Pemberton, who's one of the best known doctors in Britain, said to me something really shocking. But when you look at the scientific evidence, I think he can make a persuasive case. He said, if you gave me a choice between becoming diabetic or becoming HIV positive, I would choose becoming HIV positive, because if you're HIV positive, provided you get medical treatment, you live as long as everyone else. If you're diabetic, even if you get treatment, it has catastrophic effects on you. And that's just one of dozens of negative effects of obesity, from making it much more likely your knees will be ruined and you won't be able to walk, to getting dementia. I mean, a lot of really bad factors. So it was kind of weird to be, because of course a lot of what I'm doing in the book is weighing the risk of the drugs versus the risk of obesity. But to do that, you have to really do a clear-headed look at the risks of obesity. And unfortunately and heartbreakingly, they're really bad. On average. Of course, there are exceptions, but on average, they're really quite bad. And it's not a form of love for us to not look that in the eye, right? And not acknowledge that, especially now we have these new tools, which are risky, but, for people with severe obesity, certainly less risky than I believe than the alternative at the moment.
And my last question. So I know the answer must be really complex, but what is your conclusion on these drugs? Would you recommend them to someone you love?
I think it's what I just said. It would depend on what their BMI and obesity level was, but I'm very conflicted. I sort of end the book with there's sort of 5 scenarios for what might happen now. And it feels quite weird that they're so different, and I don't know which one it's going to be, but I'll tell you them starting with the most pessimistic and going to the most optimistic. So the most pessimistic scenario is that it'll be like a diet drug called fen-phen in the 90s, which was marketed in exactly the way Ozempic is marketed. The front page of Time magazine was the new miracle drug. So there were 18 million prescriptions for fen-phen in 1995. And then it was discovered it caused a horrific lung disease called primary pulmonary hypertension and killed huge numbers of people. And it led to the biggest payout in the history of the pharmaceutical industry. It's paid out $12 billion to the people who were catastrophically injured and their families. So I don't think that's likely, but you can't rule it out, right?
No.
That's a possible scenario. The next scenario, going to slightly more optimistic, is that they're a bit like chemical antidepressants. So chemical antidepressants give most people who take them some relief, but sadly over time the effect seems to wear off for most people, not everyone. And for the people who are benefiting from chemical antidepressants watching this, carry on taking them. But sadly the best research shows most people do become depressed again. So it happened to me when I took them. So there's a scenario where these drugs work, but the effect wears off over time. We don't know They don't wear off for diabetics, but we might develop tolerance for them for obesity, a bit like you said about was it your uncle with his bariatric surgery? Yes. He lost a lot of weight, but went back to where he was before. It's rare among bariatric surgery, but not totally rare. So it might be that the drugs work, but the effect wears off. And so 10 years from now, I'll be back where I would have been. The third option is that they're more like statins. So statins, for people who don't know, they're for people with high cholesterol, and they don't deal with the factors in the environment that cause high cholesterol, but they deal with a mechanism that controls cholesterol. So statins are one of the most prescribed drugs in the whole world. They're the most prescribed drug in the United States. So they could be like statins. They just work pretty well and the benefits outweigh the costs. But I put a little catch to that. So in this third scenario, I'd say they're like statins, but statins are cheap. At the moment, these drugs are extremely expensive. They're not expensive to manufacture. They only cost about $40 a month to manufacture, but they're very expensive because the money is going to Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly, the companies that make these drugs. Now, they argue, and it's not an unreasonable argument, well, we spent a fortune developing these drugs. Most of the drugs we try and develop don't turn out to be this valuable. So, look, it makes sense that we make money when we produce something that does work. I think there's some argument for that given the way that the current economy works, but they don't need to make as much money as they're currently making. Either way, the Ozempic will be out of patent in 2032, at which point these will mostly be pills, assuming we're not in a fen-phen scenario where there's some disaster. There'll be daily pills, they'll be pretty cheap. But between now and then, the risk is, in this scenario, that they're like statins, they work, but only a tiny elite of rich people get to use them. So the Real Housewives of New Jersey get to be super skinny, and the real school children of New Jersey get diabetes at the age of 12, right? Scenario 4 is they're like statins, but we find a way to get them to everyone who needs them and wants them, right? There's lots of ways the price might come down. The drug companies might start competing to lower the price. We might regulate the drug companies to lower the prices. There's all sorts of ways we could do that. But so that they work, they outweigh the risks, and we get them to everyone who needs them. The fifth scenario, which is the one I most hope for, is the drugs work, the benefits outweigh the risks, we get them to everyone who needs them, and at the same time, it wakes us up to go, what the fuck? How did we get to the point where half the population want to drug themselves? Why did we let the food companies poison us and screw up the way we eat and our metabolisms? Why don't we change the way the food system works and our school system? Why don't we follow what Japan did so our kids don't have to drug themselves all their lives or be obese all their lives, right? So that we get the benefit of the drugs, but we also have an awakening around how we got to this point. If you ask me what is the most likely scenario, I'm not confident, but it's probably number 3, that they work, that the benefits broadly outweigh the risks, but that only a small number of people are going to get them for now. But we'll go to scenario 4 in 2032, which is not that far away. It's 8 years away. But I'm going to fight for scenario 5, and I hope other people will join me.
Yes, I'll join you, and I hope
Hooray!
our listeners will join us as well.
If there's both of us, how can we fail?
Exactly.
Hooray.
Johann, thank you so much for this conversation. It was really enlightening. I learned so much insight into, how these drugs work, the psychology behind it all, our relationship with food as a society, and how dysfunctional it is. Thank you so much.
You asked great questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And can you please tell our listeners where they can find your book and when it's coming out?
Yes, it's called Magic. If you go to magicpillbook.com, you can see where to get the audiobook, the ebook, and the physical book. You can basically get them anywhere. I meant to say you can get them from all good bookshops, my publishers say, but you can also get them from shitty bookshops. Yeah. We don't have a test. But and you can also see what loads of famous people have said about the books and lots of professors and things. And if you want to know about my other books, you go to johannhari.com and you can get links to all the other books.
Perfect. Thank you so much.